besides the tree coming down. And that is that for some reason, like the PowerPoint or the computer over there in the back has made the colors of my slides, which I didn't change, a lot more vivid. So that'll be interesting as we go along. This is not turned on. Yes, it is. This is turned on too. Yeah. Okay. Well, whatever. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. Great. No problem. So it's kind of funny. I was just thinking, on a day, on sort of a dreary Minnesota early winter day, we got to eat some, baked lemon and date syrup and some things from the Mediterranean, which evokes, bright sunshine and an arid landscape with the waves of the Mediterranean Ocean in the background. And now we have vivid colors to go along with that too. The bright sunshine, the blue water. Dynasty, and as you can see, I ran out of room vertically, and so we're continuing on here. And these last kings and these last two chapters, it's kind of complicated, and so I'll just summarize for you. So we're at Yoshia, Josiah here, and now Yoshia's son, we're going to start off with Jehoahaz, and then his brother, Jehoiakim, and then it'll be his son, Jehoiachin, and then it'll be his uncle. So Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim's brother will be the final king. So all three of these guys, here, and here, were all sons of Josiah. You'll see why this happens as we read the text, but Jehoahaz was captured and taken captive to Egypt. Jehoiakim was captured and taken captive to Babylon. And Jehoiachin was captured and taken captive to Babylon. And Zedekiah was the final king, was also captured and taken captive to Babylon. And interestingly, some years later, the king of Babylon had mercy on Jehoiachin and released him from prison, and he lived out the rest of his life eating at the king's table in the Babylonian Empire. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, hello? Is that on? Okay. Ooh, that's on. Okay. All right. So, a little hard to see the names here with the color background, but that's okay. Now, God basically gives up using these worldly, disobedient men as effective leaders of his people. And we can see he transitions now over to the spiritual leadership is transitioning over to the prophets. And these are the prophets whose lives overlapped this end king period. We have Jeremiah, Yirmiah, and we have Ezekiel, Yehezkel, and we have Daniel. And Yehezkel and Daniel's prophetic ministry were mainly in the Babylonian Empire. That's where they primarily lived. Both were taken captive from Israel. into the Babylonian captivity. And Jeremiah was not as fortunate as that. We don't know exactly for sure how Jeremiah ended up, but tradition says that he was martyred, and most people think that he was, against his will, sort of taken with some Hebrew refugees that went back to Egypt, and that he was killed in Egypt. But we don't know for sure. But one thing we do know is that Jeremiah was not taken to Babylon as a Hebrew captive. So we have the 18th generation here since King David, and then Jehoiakim would be the 19th generation, the final generation. One other thing to point out here is that, and it's something that I never learned before reading the excellent book that I've taught you about before called Forsaking Israel, where Doug Bookman writes a chapter and then several appendixes to that excellent book on dispensational theology. It's a very readable book. It's relatively short, and it's very, very good. I would highly recommend it. Forsaking Israel. And the editor is Pettigrew, and it's written by the professors in the seminary that Doug Bookman is at now, called the Shepherd's Seminary in North Carolina. But the Ezekiel's prophecy explains that the Spirit of Yahweh left the temple prior to its destruction. And it was near the beginning of Zedekiah's reign, the year, because Ezekiel uses very clear timestamps, and we have very good archaeological evidence to correspond timing in Ezekiel, and at this time period generally, we know that year was 592 BC, when God says he specifically removed his presence, the spirit of his presence, from the Ark of the Covenant, from the temple. And obviously a bad sign. And so that would be this point here. So one really important thing that we're going to read about too is there is still, of course, some controversy about the ark. Where is the ark? And if we take what we know from what the Bible tells us literally, and we're not going to use all this sort of secular archaeology and dating and all this kind of, garbage that comes from people that don't believe in God sometimes at all, or don't believe that God did miracles, and for example say that the Torah wasn't written until this time period, 500 BC, for example. Those folks, if we discount all of that and we just take the Word of God for what it plainly says, what we'll see is that the Ark of the Covenant was there during Josiah's reign, but it was being safeguarded by the priesthood. There were times when they removed it from the Holy of Holies for safekeeping. And we'll see that during Josiah's reign, he asked the priests to replace it, and they did. An Egyptian pharaoh comes in first and attacks and pillages, but after that point, the account we read today says that the ark was still there. So the Egyptian pharaoh did not get his hands on the ark, possibly because he avoided it, because he was a smart guy, or the priesthood had hidden it, so it wasn't there to steal. Now, Nebuchadnezzar came in 3 times to destroy and destroy the land of Judah and to deport its people as captives back to Babylon. And it's very likely that during one of those episodes of Nebuchadnezzar's attack and destruction, that Nebuchadnezzar either took it back to Babylon or destroyed it on site. So we don't know. Does it matter? I would say not at all. Why? So what would happen if we discovered the ark today under the sands of southern Iraq in the area of the former Babylon? Nothing would happen because it's just a box with gold on it. Okay, the Spirit of God does not reside in or around or on that box anymore. When that stopped was 592 BC, and it never came back. So, so Indiana Jones is fiction. It's really fun and interesting fiction, but it's fiction nonetheless. All right. So, and that might explain also, well, Nebuchadnezzar couldn't have destroyed the ark on site, and melted it down and trampled it into dust, right? Because God would have prevented that. God would have done something. God would have struck him from heaven with a lightning bolt or whatever. If anybody that touched it, right? God stopped caring about the ark, okay, in 592 BC. So, all right. So let's go on. Yoshia, verse 35, chapter 35, verse 1. Yoshia kept a Passover to Yahweh in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the first month. So remember that Yoshia's great-grandfather, Hizkiah, which was Hezekiah, he also celebrated a Passover, and this was a chance to take the whole community in action as a way of reconnecting with Yahweh, with their past, with obedience to the Torah, with repentance. This ceremony of the Passover we see now repeatedly is a focal point of renewal, a focal point of revival, you might say, in the community of Israel. And Yoshia is following his great-grandfather's footsteps and doing the same thing. He appointed the priests to their offices and encouraged them in the service of the house of Yahweh. And he said to the Levites who taught all Israel and were holy to Yahweh, "Put the holy ark in the house that Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, built. You need not carry it on your shoulders." And the Hebrew does not say this, but I think that it's implied. You need not carry it on your shoulders any longer after this. Now, why would Yoshia be telling them this? I think that there's a couple things. Yoshia knows, because of the prophecy that we learned about last week, that God's destruction is coming. And I think that Yoshia might have a feeling or even a word from Yahweh here that he is the last of the faithful kings before this destruction is coming. And so I think what he's meaning here is this idea that you have to take the ark in and out to protect it from evil kings. I don't think that you need to do that anymore because I'm a faithful king, and you don't need to do that to protect the ark from me or what I might do in disobedience. That might be one thing that he's getting at here. But there's debate on it. Now serve Yahweh, your Elohim, and his people Israel. Prepare yourselves according to your fathers' houses by your divisions as prescribed in the writing of King David of Israel and the document of Solomon his son. And stand in the holy place according to the groupings of the fathers' houses of your brothers, the lay people, and according to the division of the Levites by father's household. And slaughter the Passover lamb according to the word of Yahweh by Moses. Now, these documents that he's referring to here are lost to history. We don't have them. But King David and Solomon had created some administrative organization to how the community would do Passover because so many Hebrews came to Jerusalem for this festival, the most important of the year. And they all had to sacrifice, and they all had to eat together of the sacrifice. And the sacrifice of the Passover lamb was only to be done by the priesthood at the temple it was a huge logistical, endeavor. And David at Solomon had worked out the logistics of how this was done. And this was all written out in documentation that he's referring to here that we don't have anymore. Then Yoshia contributed to the lay people as Passover offerings for all who were present, lambs and young goats from the flock to the number of 30,000 and 3,000 bulls. These were from the king's possessions. And his officials contributed willingly to the people, to the priests, and to the Levites. When the service had been prepared for, the priests stood in their place, and the Levites in their divisions according to the king's command. And they slaughtered the Passover lamb, and the priests threw the blood that they received from them, while the Levites flayed the sacrifices. And they set aside the burnt offerings that they might distribute them according to the groupings of the fathers' houses of the lay people, and to offer to Yahweh as it is written in the book of Moses. And so they did with the bulls. And they roasted the Passover lamb with fire according to the rule, and they boiled the holy offerings in pots and cauldrons and in pans, and carried them quickly to all the lay people. And afterward they prepared for themselves and for the priests, because the priests, the sons of Aaron, were offering the burnt offerings and the fat parts until night. So the Levites prepared for themselves and for the priests, the sons of Aaron. The singers, the sons of Asaph, were in their place according to the command of David, and Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, the king's seer, and the gatekeepers were at each gate. They did not need to depart from their service, for their brothers, the Levites, prepared for them. So all the service of Yahweh was prepared that day to keep the Passover and the burnt offerings on the altar of Yahweh according to the command of King Yoshia. And the people of Israel who were present kept the Passover at that time and the feast of unleavened bread 7 days. No Passover like it had been kept in Israel since the days of Samuel the prophet. None of the kings of Israel had kept such a Passover as was kept by Yoshia. And the priests and the Levites and all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of the reign of Yoshia, this Passover was kept. So just a couple points. What was so special about this Passover that none had ever been done like this? I mean, Ezra is making a point that this was amazing, and nothing had been done like this for Passover since the time of Samuel. Since before the whole king dynasty started, before King David even. And so there's some debate about it. It sounds like he was careful and conscientious to do it according to the Torah's instructions. It might have been the degree of participation. So that's, I think, what makes the most sense. It might have been, like the percentage of the population actually coming and being involved with it. It might have been, very close to a very high percentage, 80%, 90%, who knows? But that's probably what it's getting at here. All right, 2 Chronicles 35:20. After all this, when Yoshia had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Yoshia went out to meet him. So this wonderful, faithful king has flaws, as we all do, and we're going to learn this tragic flaw, this tragic mistake. So Egypt is a major kingdom. So is Babylon. The Persians are just getting started. So that's Elam and Media. And the Babylonian Empire now is on the rise. We don't yet call this area the Persian Empire. The names on this map are a little later. Right now, this area up here is still the Assyrian Empire. But remember, the Assyrian Empire has been in decline. And for generations, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonians have been going back and forth. And so now we have this world-changing battle where Egypt takes the side of the Assyrians. So they're on one team, the red team. And the red team is coming up, and they're meeting here for this giant battle. The Babylonians are the blue team. They're coming up, and they're meeting for this battle. The winner is going to control everything. And Judah is like this little, insect on the road on the way. I don't know what Yoshia is thinking. Just prideful, young man, stupidity. I don't know what you call it, okay? But we have this amazing major power army coming up through here, and we have Josiah thinking that he's going to do something special here and get involved. Oh boy, this is going to be hard. Sorry about the slides. This is crazy. But he sent envoys to him saying, "What have we to do with each other, king of Judah?" So this is Pharaoh Necho sending messengers to Yoshia. "What do we have to do with each other, king of Judah? I am not coming against you this day, but against the house with which I am at war. And Elohim has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing Elohim, who is with me, lest he destroy you." Nevertheless, Yoshia did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of Elohim, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo, and the archers shot King Yoshia. And the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in his second chariot, brought him to Jerusalem, and he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. So he was buried in honor for being a good king. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Yoshia. And Egypt went on to join the battle, and the Babylonians were victorious in that battle. And that was the ascendancy now of the Babylonian Empire. Jeremiah, this is Jeremiah, also uttered a lament for Yoshia, and all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Yoshia in their laments to this day. They made these a rule in Israel. Behold, they are written in the laments. This is not the book of Lamentations, by the way. This is another, perhaps, writing. It looks like it's another writing that's been lost. Now, the rest of the acts of Yoshia and his good deeds, according to what is written in the Torah of Yahweh, and his acts, first and last, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. Oh, I'm sorry. The people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Yoshia, and made him king in his father's place. In Jerusalem, Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. The king of Egypt deposed him in Jerusalem and laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. So this is Yoshia's son, now who becomes king. He went up against the Egyptian Pharaoh. The Egyptian Pharaoh, is victorious and kills him. And now this relatively small and unimportant kingdom of Judah becomes a vassal state of the Egyptians. The Babylonians defeated the Egyptians in that battle. And so the Babylonians are the big dog. But until the Babylonians enforce their rule on this area, this is closer to Egypt, and so they're within Egypt's sphere of influence. And that's what's going on here. And the king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But Necho took Jehoahaz, his brother, and carried him to Egypt. And Jehoahaz is to die there, never to return, a prisoner in Egypt. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh his Elohim. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in chains to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried part of the vessels of the house of Yahweh to Babylon and put them in his palace in Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations that he did, and what was found against him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And Jehoiakim, his son, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. In the spring of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the precious vessels of the house of Yahweh, and made his brother Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. So here's a reference to the precious vessels of the house of Yahweh being taken by King Nebuchadnezzar. And so certainly the Ark of the Covenant would be considered a precious vessel within the temple. So this would be the closest and most precise description of what might have happened to the ark that we have in Scripture. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh his Elohim. He did not humble himself before Yirmiah the prophet, who spoke from the mouth of Yahweh. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear by Elohim. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel. All the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they polluted the house of Yahweh that he had made holy in Jerusalem. So we could see an unfaithful priesthood, an unfaithful king. And so God has raised up the prophets to be the leaders of his people at this time. And the most prominent now is Jeremiah. Yahweh, the Elohim of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of Elohim, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of Yahweh rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans. That's the Chaldeans is another name for the Babylonians, who killed their young men with a sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and on the vessels of the house of Elohim, great and small, and the treasures of the house of Yahweh, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned down the house of Elohim, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all of its palaces with fire, and destroyed all of its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. And Ezra is referring now to the Torah requirement to let the land go unused, unplanted, unharvested for 1 out of every 7 years. It was called the Sabbath year. And it was, it's hard to say exactly what the purpose of that was, other than to say that at least one of the purposes was to train the people of God to trust first in Yahweh, to be their provision and not in their own strength. And obviously, if you're living year to year and subsisting on the produce of your field, and you're expected once every 7 years to not plant and not harvest, that's going to be a trust-building time, obviously. But there's little evidence that the Israelites ever really did that, or did it much. Obviously, there were probably many faithful Israelites that did it on their own, but as a general national trend, there's not evidence that that was practiced. And so what we have here is Ezra saying, you know, one thing that makes sense about the time period of the captivity in Babylon, the 70 years, is that that's God taking back all those Sabbath years that were never given to him. So, and the numbers add up to match. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Okay, so now this is the end of Ezra, and this is Ezra's concluding statement now. He's bringing it all back. And remember, the purpose of 2nd Chronicles, the purpose of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, was for Ezra to write a history, to inspire and to encourage his people returning from Babylonian captivity. And now what he's doing is he's done with the history, and now he's bringing it back to the present moment. And the present moment is the Persian Empire now has conquered the Babylonian Empire, and the first Persian Empire's leader, Cyrus, has made this proclamation to allow the Jewish people to return to Israel. And so we're bringing it back to the present moment, around 500 BC. Cyrus proclaims, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the Elohim of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may Yahweh his Elohim be with him. Let him go up." And that is the end. And being that we have the Christmas tree up and it's the Christmas season, I'll make a point here. This phrase is very important among the Jewish people. May Yahweh, his Elohim, be with him. Let him go up, meaning go up to Jerusalem. What was one of the two names that Yahweh gave to his son specifically? There were two names that were told in Matthew. One we're familiar with. Yes. Jesus, or Yeshua in Hebrew. And what was the other name? No, the Christ is Messiah, is the Greek word for Messiah. So that would be more like a title, not a name. Yes, Emmanuel. And Matthew tells us Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. And whoever is among you of all his people, may Yahweh, his Elohim, be with him. So it's very significant. Remember that 2nd Chronicles is the end of the Old Testament. The Christian church rearranged the book order. It's not clear why that was done, but the Old Testament, the Tanakh, is written in a pattern of Torah, prophets, writings. And Chronicles is the last of the writings. This verse here is the very last verse of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. And so we have the very last verse that ends with, may Yahweh, his Elohim, be with him. Let him go up. To all the people return to. And then we have Matthew at the very beginning of his gospel saying that Yahweh names his son God with us. So I think that's pretty significant. Questions? Yeah. No, yeah. Just like the Sabbath day was a set day of the week, the Sabbath year was a set year. So, yeah. Yeah, there were some Hebrews, obviously, who were not taken to Babylon. I don't know about numbers. I don't think I've seen a chart or anything, someone saying, what the percentages were. But there was a significant leftover community. Anybody of wealth or importance or of talent or was specifically chosen by the Babylonians to take back to Babylon. So, yeah. They weren't a great remnant. They weren't faithful. I mean, Jeremiah, possibly in Lamentations, I'd have to go back and look at that, but I know in Jeremiah he talks about that issue. Also, at the end of the book of 2 Kings, I believe it talks about that issue as well. So Nebuchadnezzar appointed a Jewish governor of the area, and not very much time went by before that Jewish governor was assassinated by these Jewish people, the remnant of Jewish people who were still living there. And then they got scared about reprisals for doing that, and then they went to Egypt. And they took, apparently, tradition says they took Jeremiah with them to Egypt. Right, yeah. The reestablishment of the people of Israel would be the returning exiles. Yeah. Not only that, but it was basically 2 generations later. And if you think about an unfaithful remnant just intermarrying with the non-Jewish people who lived, who the Assyrians had brought in into the area of Samaria, you know what I mean, and all that was going on. So that's why Ezra and Nehemiah were so careful when the exiles came back, not to intermarry, not to allow that. They wanted to keep those lines very clear. So in the mold of Passover being used as a teaching point and a focal point of revival, Pastor and I have been talking about the church doing a Passover meal together, the whole ceremony on a Sunday night, this coming Passover. The Passover falls on a Saturday night this year, the one weekend before Easter. And so we thought that it would make sense to do it on the Sunday night as the Sunday night service. And with our new fellowship hall and everything, I think it would be really great. It'll not be anything that I've ever done before for a large group. I've had Passover in my home for years, and we never had more than maybe 10 or 12 people at any one time. So it's the logistics, but we're just starting to talk about it. We'll make it work, and it'll be good. I think it'll be a really fun teaching moment. There's a traditional service, obviously, but there's also a traditional variation among Messianic Jews, which is the service that we'll be doing, because we want to point out all of the things in the tradition that point towards the Messiah, and not only a Messiah in general, but actually point towards Jesus as the Messiah. So remembering that many of those traditions actually predate Jesus. So it's really cool. And it's also cool because it helps us to connect with Jesus' life as well, the life of him and his disciples. So we'll keep you posted on that. Questions about anything else? Nope? Okay, great.